There's a quote I like from the philosopher Karl Popper, who said, "We do not know, we can only guess." And so much remains unknown as the world awaits the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And though aerial satellite surveillance may assist in knowing where Russia is fortifying its defenses, a most important unknown is exactly where Ukraine will attempt to launch it and exactly when. These unknowns remain unknown for strategically important reasons. Though, as we entered the first week of June of 2023, some have speculated that elements of a counteroffensive may have already begun, as well as the Russian efforts to counteract it. Aside from more minor shaping operations, as they are called, that have occurred over the past couple of weeks, a more significant case in point may be the recent attack upon the Nova Kakhovka Dam. The dam, 98 feet high and 2 miles long, built across the Dnipro River and 50 miles from the city of Kherson, had created an enormous reservoir with an approximate volume equal to Utah's Great Salt Lake. Russian forces had taken control of the dam at the start of their February 2022 invasion. For the dam has strategic importance, and for multiple reasons. Its energy generation, for one, which also includes the water it controls, providing the cooling reservoir pool for the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, as well as for supplying the fresh water needed by the Crimean Peninsula. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned in October that Russia had mined the dam and would explode it to preempt an offensive aimed at reclaiming occupied southern and eastern regions of the country. Such might have been just what happened here, for the massive floodwaters released from the attacked dam could cause the land downstream to be a more difficult slog through the mud should the Ukrainians attempt a counteroffensive there, and at the very moment in the year when the ground might otherwise be ripe for a counteroffensive. Though retired U.S. General David Petraeus has said that he doesn't feel that the destruction of the dam will significantly impact the Ukrainian offensive, whose ultimate goal is to advance to the Sea of Azov, cutting off the land bridge between Russia-occupied Crimea and the Russian-occupied Donbass. In fact, Petraeus points out that once the floodwaters recede, the river will actually be shallower and easier to cross. But not surprisingly, official spokesmen for both Russia and Ukraine deny culpability and blame each other for the attack. Only one of them is being truthful. And when it comes to speaking the truth, or any care about doing damage to the environment or the people who live there, I trust readers or viewers to make their own informed guess as to who should be believed. But even those arguing for a counteroffensive already underway also agree that we're still waiting for the main event, and it's still unknowable outcomes. Karl Popper has told us that our knowledge is finite, while what we don't know is infinite. Though what we do know from the past may still be in play as we attempt to look forward to the future. And, with this said, those not reliant upon Russian state-sponsored TV have long known that the war was hardly just a, quote, special military exercise. In fact, the current estimates are that since the inception of the war, that 200,000 Russian soldiers have now been removed from the battlefield, whether from their wounds or their deaths. And we also know that that figure of 200,000 is a nearly identical number to the troops amassing near Ukraine's border just prior to the war's beginning. So, in other words, Russia has already lost the initial troop deployment number with nothing really pivotal to show for it. But let's stay with that figure of 200,000 for a moment. That number of Russian troops initially deployed to Ukraine's border was sent to do battle with approximately the same number of Ukrainian troops. And as I'm about to explain further, this was just one of many ways that Russia had underestimated Ukraine. Though there can be some first strike advantage for an invading force, like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that caught the U.S. by surprise, this invasion could hardly be deemed a surprise when the invading army had been apparent and loitering for weeks on Ukraine's doorsteps, though its intentions were consistently denied from Moscow. Characteristically, those being invaded have an inherent advantage once the battle has begun, for they're fighting on their home turf and know damn well what they're fighting for, which can then give them a heightened morale advantage. Plus, there's obvious logistical advantages in keeping their troops well supplied. In part for these reasons, customary military calculations dictate that the invading troops need to outnumber those of the invaded by 3 to 1. And here, that was clearly not the case, for the troop numbers for the two armies were approximately the same. And even should the invaders gain initial territory, conventional wisdom has been that in order to then control the invaded territory, a minimum deployment force of 1 soldier for every 100 inhabitants is necessary. Now, at the inception of the war, Ukraine had a population of approximately 40 million. Wait a second. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. I was saying before the unknown element of a telephone call arrived that at the inception of the war, Ukraine had a population of 40 million, and on that metric, Russia had sent about half of what was needed. And so Russia's subsequent difficulties in maintaining control over the territories it had initially invaded should also have come as no surprise. Yet further, Russia's customary battle strategy had always been extensive aerial bombardment, often over weeks or months, knocking out its opponent's own air command and communications before sending in tanks and troops. At the war's outset, Russia significantly underestimated the scale of effort required to accomplish these goals. In a report authored by Ian Williams, entitled Putin's Missile War, Russia's Strike Campaign in Ukraine, appearing on the website of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Williams writes, "In its initial operation to gain air superiority, Russia failed to achieve mass and tried to attack too many targets with too few missiles over too short a period to achieve its desired results. Russia's strike campaign had also been undermined by frequent shifts in targeting priorities and the irregular availability of precision-guided munitions. Ukrainian air defenses had deterred Russian Air Force aircraft from launching penetrating sorties against strategic targets deep behind the front lines. This success has greatly shaped the course of the war, limiting Russian striking power to diminishing numbers of standoff missiles or uncrewed aerial systems like drones. That's the quote. But Putin was so overconfident of his own military, while underestimating Ukraine, that Russia's proven, battle-tested strategy never fully kicked in. By April, the Russian strategy had shifted to attacks on Ukraine's petroleum supplies, while the miles-long train of bombed-out Russian tanks on the road leading to Kiev at the start of the war was the evidence of that confident but misguided calculation. Such undeserved confidence can be a problem in autocratic nations, where inadequate intel is provided to leaders, giving them only what they want to hear. And that seemed the case for the Russians. For after the disastrous failure to quickly take Kiev, Putin then fired 100 of his agents and spies responsible for advanced intel. Putin, an experienced wartime president who had already overseen successful campaigns in taking over Crimea, plus victories in Chechnya and Syria, had also underestimated the yet untried Ukrainian president. Plus, he miscalculated the welcome he got from a population that, while often speaking Russian, sure as hell didn't want to be invaded by Russia. In fact, following the invasion, the skillful leadership of President Zelensky and his ability to galvanize support, both at home and abroad, led his popularity to soar to Churchillian stature. We also know that part of Putin's hegemonic grievance against the West had always had to do with the threat of NATO, which for him has been likened to how the U.S. felt about having Russian missiles but 90 miles away in Cuba during October of 1962. And Putin claims broken promises had been made to Russia during the 1990s about NATO not moving an inch further to the east. But that quote, taken out of context, and the resulting claims by Putin have been countered by many, including former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pfeiffer, who has written, Western leaders never pledged not to enlarge NATO, but that story fits so well with the picture that the Russian leader seeks to paint of an aggrieved Russia taken advantage of by others and increasingly isolated, not due to its own actions, but because of the machinations of a deceitful West. What cannot be disputed, however, is that Putin's own actions, the venality of his warfare against Ukraine, has only made other countries feel threatened by Russia and thus, like Sweden and Finland, deciding to enter NATO. While the Russian invasion also increased the unity of NATO countries and the level of economic and military support they were willing to provide to Ukraine. And rather gravely, Putin also underestimated the fiercely united resolve of the Ukrainian people, along with the united resolve of Ukraine's European and American allies in continuing to provide the weaponry that has countered Russia's inherent numerical and economic advantages. Similarly, in terms of strategic timing, Putin assumed that it was now or never to invade Ukraine, for he thought that the invasion would catch America at a weak point, following its disjointed retreat from Afghanistan, which had left American President Biden polling poorly, and when America's own fractured domestic politics were thought to be too polarized for the U.S. to mount a full-throttled response. The above litany of Putin's underestimates of his opponent's capacities, his arrogance, his dismissive regard of rightful boundaries, his overconfidence, and his entitled willingness to cause the suffering of millions of people in order to promote his own legacy for posterity is mythically very much akin to the Greek notion of hubris, the characteristic psychic pitfall suffered by the protagonists in ancient Greek tragic dramas. And this is a tragic drama. For in the Greek mythopoeic world, hubris is inevitably followed by nemesis, an armed goddess who'd been iconographically portrayed as carrying a measuring scale in one hand and a whip or sword in her other hand. With her measuring scale, she could determine those who had violated rightful proportions and boundaries. And with her whip or sword, she could then punish those guilty of the crime of hubris. Akin to Napoleon's Waterloo, Ukraine has now become Putin's nemesis, though in a similar vein, the punishment has been ultimately self-inflicted, the mythic and historical downfall of despots. Plus, at a less mythic, more material level, we know that the manufacturing part of the Russian economy is staggering now, and that the economic losses due to the sanctions placed against it are starting to kick in more now during all of 2022. And we've also known for quite a while now that Russia has been running out of missiles. The latter has been due in part to the sanctions, which in turn have also impacted Russia's manufacturing sector and its capacity to produce weapons. Simply put, Russia has been using up more missiles than it's been able to produce or acquire since the beginning of the war. For unlike Ukraine, Russia doesn't have a large number of technologically advanced allied countries with access to advanced microchips required for advanced weaponry. Prior to its one-year anniversary, the war in Ukraine had already been framed as a war of attrition. And the attritions were thought to be those of weaponry on the one hand and of natural gas on the other. The natural gas that Europe would need to keep itself warm during the winter of 2022-23. And that had also been, the natural gas that is, that had also been the main cash cow of the Russian economy. The attrition of weaponry, mainly missiles, and the need for further defensive armaments against them continues to be paramount, while those involving natural gas no longer seem quite as pivotal. For Ukraine and her European allies managed to survive the winter of 2022-23, which incidentally was the second warmest ever recorded, without the energy shortages causing Ukraine to lose the support of her European allies. And the increased cost of petroleum that the war had caused for the world has also served to spur implementation of non-fossil-based fuel sources, which could help mitigate against the world again being held hostage by energy-rich nations, whether Saudi Arabia or Russia. While at present, Russia's vast store of natural gas reserves continues to find buyers, though this doesn't entirely make up for the export losses elsewhere or the tightening sanctions. While the war had also prevented continuing development of Ukraine's own store of natural gas reserves, estimated to be sufficient enough to provide both itself and all of Europe for at least 5 years, as petroleum companies are hesitant to undertake the expenses of extraction in areas that are also a war zone. Though China and India have been economic partners of Russia and quite willing to prop up the Russian economy by buying its petroleum exports at a discounted rate, no less, neither have yet provided Russia with armaments. For that, Russia has mostly had to rely upon Iran, most notably for its low-tech drones, though for months there have been rumblings from Moscow of a fearsome hypersonic missile that Russia had been holding in reserve. It was touted to travel at multiples of the speed of sound, and its manufacturer, Rostec, previously claimed there is no countermeasure to our missiles. Similarly, Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu said last August that no one else has such a missile yet, hypersonic and with such speed and with such penetrating capabilities, arguing, per the state media readout, it is impossible to detect it or intercept. Now, I know that we Americans have been losing our attention span while relegating our memory to silicon chips, but can anybody say the word hubris again? It seems a problem with hegemonic empires. We now know these Kinzhal missiles, which Kinzhal is Russian for dagger, are launched in the air from MiG fighter jets. They soar for miles at incredible speed while being able to shift their trajectory at will on their way to their ground targets, while the planes that launch them can then scoot away, lessening their danger of getting shot down by anti-aircraft defenses. In a way, the Kinzhals could be seen as an answering move to the HIMARS weapon systems that had arrived on the battlefield in late June of 2022 and that greatly empowered the last Ukrainian counteroffensive. For the HIMARS also have a scoot-away capacity, though they are not launched from planes, but by trucks that can then scoot away at 60 miles an hour before enemy fire can retaliate. The U.S. also has another missile operable from the same HIMARS platform, one whose range is approximately 190 miles versus the 50-mile range of those currently supplied to Ukraine. The U.S. military also has been developing another missile capable of being launched from the same HIMARS platform, one with a range of approximately 300 miles and capable of being a further deterrent to Moscow. Estimates are that it will become available during 2024. But the Biden regime has thus far only made the 190-mile ranged HIMARS missiles available to be ordered by NATO partners in the region, as if not quite trusting Ukraine's disciplined restraint in restricting its aggression to efforts solely within its own territory, and again, for fear of an escalating retaliation by Russia, which will be an ongoing theme in this reportage. When it comes to warfare, a political scientist might recognize wars as failures of diplomacy, while a psychotherapist wouldn't have to work very hard in order to uncover facets of psychopathology, for they are failures of sanity, failures of empathy, if not a collective psychosis. And nothing is less subtle or more predictable than the behaviors of those under the sway of a psychopathology. Yet, unlike those suffering from a personality disorder, the fog of war makes them inherently unpredictable and the most dangerous of contagions. And though wars have a built-in unpredictability factor, they do have more recognizable inflection points whose influence may extend not only short-term, but well into the future. And when future historians write about the war in Ukraine, they'll likely devote a good deal of attention to the fourth week of June in 2022. Until that week, the Russians had been making gains in the east and threatening to overrun Luhansk. But the fourth week in June is when the HIMARS missile systems arrived on the battlefield and proved to be decisive in staunching Russian advances and beginning Ukraine's successful summer and fall counteroffensive that managed to retake much of the territory that the Russians had claimed since April. Now, the fourth week in June is also when the European Union officially made Ukraine, as well as neighboring Moldova, candidates for membership, a process that under normal conditions might have taken years before eventuating, and a process that wouldn't have even started had Putin not invaded Ukraine. For until then, EU leaders wouldn't have seriously considered starting Ukraine on the path to membership, given Ukraine's history of oligarchy and corruption, coupled with the EU's concerns of Russian retaliation. Though Ukraine's full accession to the EU could still be years away, it was a major commitment of solidarity towards Ukraine, and at the same time a major rebuke of Putin, who for years had done everything in his power to prevent Ukraine from strengthening its ties to the West. For years, Putin had claimed that Ukraine never really existed as a sovereign entity, and had conceived of it instead as a flanking zone meant to protect Russia's regional sovereignty. In fact, it was Ukraine's desire to draw closer to the European Union that had precipitated the past decade of conflict. For it should be remembered that in 2013, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was about to sign an EU trade deal that Russia then pressured him to nix. Mass protests then broke out, toppling Yanukovych, who then fled to Moscow, and Putin responded by illegally seizing Crimea from Ukraine. And on the same day in Brussels that Ukraine and Moldova began their ascension towards EU membership, in Washington, the White House authorized a $450 million package of new military aid to Ukraine, in addition to billions already in play. While also on the same day, what appeared to be 2 Russian cruise missiles hit Bakhmut, a supply hub for Ukraine, and a city that was to be fiercely fought over until the present time, with the Russians intermittently announcing victory and Ukraine responding with more troops deployed, as if to say, not yet. For quite a while it's been known that the Wagner Group has been leading Russia's campaign to capture Bakhmut, and that Ukraine's adaptive defense against the Kinzhals could come from two weapons possessed by the U.S., but denied to Ukraine since the inception of the war. The first would be from armed jets that can shoot down the planes that launch them, yet without violating Russian airspace. This would have required the U.S. and Ukraine's other Western allies to once more get past the cautionary red lines they've consistently self-administered in order to lessen the risk of Russian escalation. In this case, by providing Ukraine with advanced fourth-generation fighter jets, such as the American F-16s. And as for protection against the missiles themselves, that would have greatly been aided by giving Ukraine access to the American-made Patriot ground-to-air missile defense system, which for years has represented state-of-the-art in terms of missile defense. When inadequate planning and an underestimate of Ukraine's ability to defend itself led Russia to fail in its initial assumption that the war would end in a matter of days by overtaking Kiev and its government and then installing a Russian proxy, the war then moved into the second stage of a conventional ground war. Initially, Russia captured large swaths of Ukrainian territory, often committing unspeakable war crimes upon the civilians in the territories they'd captured. Though the Ukrainian military also proved itself to be courageous, resourceful, and faster on its feet, due in part to a less top-down, more responsive command structure. But here, as the fighting continued, and as Ukraine began to receive more armaments from its allies, Russia began to run really low in its missile supply. And when the American-supplied HIMARS appeared on the battlefield in late June of 2022, it enabled the Ukrainian army to mount a successful counteroffensive that managed to retake much, though not all, of the territory that the Russians had captured since April. While beginning to lose territory in the ground war, the Russian strategy increasingly began to involve attacking Ukraine's civilian population and energy grid, largely through the employment of Iranian drones. The drones themselves are very low-tech and slow, 115 miles an hour, and about as loud and fast as a rattling old Volkswagen Bug in approaching its top speed. You could hear them coming. Plus, to make them even more vulnerable, they then hover over their targets before exploding upon them. Individually, they've thus been easy to shoot down, and measuring barely 8 feet long, I think it's 8 foot 2 inches exactly, they are capable of only a tiny payload. But when sent in waves, along with missiles with a far higher payload, the effect had been devastating to Ukraine's civilian population and its energy grid. Now more than ever, Ukraine was badly in need of better missile defense systems, and the American-made Patriot missile defense system, though costly, was the best that money could buy. The war in Ukraine is in a stage of transition now, where what lies ahead remains largely unseen. In such times of transition, the Romans turned to the god Janus, as he was thought to provide a unique and then needed perspective. For Janus was a two-headed god, with one of his heads facing the future and the other head facing the past and what could be learned from it. In this vein, let's look back in time for a moment to an earlier inflection point, to late February 2023, the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine war. At that time, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was making the rounds on the U.S. political talk shows. In them, he defended what others have seen as a reluctance on the part of the U.S. to provide Ukraine more of what it really needs and to provide it sooner, while affirming the U.S. support of Ukraine to be unwavering and for as long as it takes. Sullivan attempted to counter the critique of his regime's cautious, incremental support of Ukraine by saying that the U.S. commitment is to provide Ukraine with what it needs, but only when it needs it. Though grateful for the enormity of American support, this might have struck Ukrainian ears like the rationalized statement of an imperious parent who not only holds the purse strings, but presumes he knows best, while in fact, Ukrainian leadership has given every indication that it knows what it is doing and what it needs when, more than anyone else. I'm not saying Sullivan's sober caution and understandable spin doctrine was actually lying, nor would I wish to slight the virtue that caution can have, though winged victory also often smiles on the more daring. And in subsequent months, the U.S. had supplied Ukraine with Abrams tanks, while Germany had answered in kind by supplying its Leopards, but only following the American offer of its Abrams. But still, Ukrainian President Zelensky had been pleading for aircraft since the onset of the war. At that time, the U.S. had nixed the offer by Poland to provide Ukraine with its own supply of MiG-29 fighter jets, which the Ukrainians already knew how to fly, if only the U.S. would agree and assist in getting them to Ukraine, which the U.S. refused to do. "Sorry, son, not ready to give you the keys to the sky above you." In truth, though, so much of the devastation Ukraine has suffered has not come from armored vehicles on the ground or infantry combatants armed with various versions of Kalashnikovs or the standard issue MP 443 Yarrigan pistol, but instead death and the massive destruction of Ukraine's buildings and infrastructure has come from the sky. So we're beginning to further evoke the need for F-16s and Patriot missiles again. And with Janus's backward-looking vision, we might see the fear of Russian escalation that has caused red lines to be placed against them in the first place. While with Janus's other set of eyes, we might see their role in the coming counteroffensive. In facing the counteroffensive, a further problem considered had been how long it can take to train pilots, Ukrainian pilots, to fly the F-16s, which might have led the U.S. to make them available this past February when Sullivan was appearing on television. Great Britain, however, has been very good at simulator training, which can introduce the software characteristics of the F-16 into the simulators without requiring the planes themselves. But for training civilians without prior combat flight experience, the learning curve to become proficient in piloting the F-16s could still take a very long time, and hence perhaps questionable help for the upcoming counteroffensive. Yet it had also been argued that should combat experienced Ukrainian pilots be trained, say, in Arizona, it could take but a couple of months for them to be capable of flying the F-16s. And Congress had already appropriated funds for such training months ago. But the breaking news is that the cautious Biden administration has just okayed the employment of fourth-generation jets, such as the F-16s, though the training will not take place in the U.S. Instead, Ukrainian President Zelensky thanked British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for his support in forming a coalition that has vowed to deliver F-16 jets to Kiev in the coming months and to train Ukrainian pilots to fly the sophisticated U.S.-made fighters starting in the next few weeks. Though this late in the game, with the planes not arriving for months, it remains to be seen how pivotal these jets will be for the coming counteroffensive. For as stated earlier, we don't know when the counteroffensive will officially begin, let alone when it will end. But at the very least, the Biden administration had stopped being so cautious out of its fear of Russian escalation, and this was another inflection point with implications for the future. As for the Patriots, they had been initially requested by Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov when he visited the U.S. in August of 2021, 7 months prior to Russia's full-scale invasion and 7 years after Russia illegally annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. But Reznikov was told that his request was impossible. Such an imperious word, but based on what? This reluctance on the part of the U.S. to better equip Ukraine had been nothing new, and likely thus not entirely unexpected by Reznikov, for this had been a constant for nearly 3 decades, and once led a highly placed Ukrainian official to say of the U.S., "You won't let us drown, but you won't let us swim." By the 3rd week in April of 2023, American-made Patriot missiles arrived in Ukraine, providing Kiev with the long-sought shield against Russian airstrikes that had devastated Ukraine's cities and civilian infrastructure. And a second Patriot system has reportedly been provided jointly by Germany and the Netherlands. The Patriot surface-to-air missile systems can target aircraft, cruise missiles, and the shorter-range ballistic missiles such as those that Russia had used to bombard residential areas and civilian infrastructure. With Russia already low on missiles, they had been led to convert missiles originally intended for air and sea targets to land targets, and so their damage to civilian sites has likely been a mixture of inadequate accuracy by the converted missiles combined with an intentional civilian terrorism that has violated the Geneva Conventions. But either way, with the delivery of the first Patriot anti-missile system, Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov tweeted, "Today, our beautiful Ukrainian sky becomes more secure," while elsewhere he termed it a dream now come true. For the Patriots have an enviable accuracy and are the most sophisticated systems possessed by the U.S. Army to protect against incoming missiles. Each Patriot battery can launch multiple rockets at the same time upon incoming targets. Yet experts have warned that the arrival of such a system is not a cure-all. For as far as we know, Ukraine only now possesses 2 of these systems to defend the sky of a country nearly twice as large as California and larger than the territories of France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, or Poland. Plus, the Patriot systems are really costly. Though official cost figures for the Patriots are not publicly available, the Congressional Research Service, relying upon reportage from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published on December 16, 2022, tells us that a newly produced battery system for the Patriots cost $1.1 billion. And that doesn't include the cost of the missiles themselves, which currently cost about $4 million per missile. And it should be noted that the lag time between the approval for the American order and the Patriots' actual arrival in Ukraine was approximately 6 months. Yet in terms of red tape, startup and manufacturing time by America's defense contractors, plus their transit time, 6 months was unbelievably swift. By comparison, the recent time frame given for the U.S. to provide Australia with only 3 nuclear submarines, and those without nuclear weapons at that, had been 9 years. But back to the Patriots. In regarding the financial aspects of warfare, the exorbitant costs of the Patriot missiles would make them perhaps a questionable long-term antidote to the flood of Iranian drones that Russia has been launching at Ukraine for the better part of a year. For the cost differential between the Patriots and the Iranian drones is huge. Compared to $4 million for each Patriot missile, the drones cost the Russians barely $20,000 each. Ukrainian President Zelensky had quite early in the war, like late March 2022, like just 1 month into the war, pleaded to Israel for its own excellent missile defense system, the Iron Dome, which had had the reputation for a 90% success rate in negating missiles launched at Israel from Gaza. But Israel already had a deal in place with Russia that had worked out quite well for Israeli security. For Russia allowed the Israelis to launch air missions over Syrian airspace in order to knock out weapon stashes elsewhere in the region that were meant to be used against Israel. And so Zelensky's plea to Israel, which included calling Israel out for not sanctioning Russia, as other nations had done, largely fell on deaf ears. And going forward, there's the remaining prospect that Ukraine will have to deal with continued drone attacks on its energy grid, while still needing to find alternative missile defense systems elsewhere. The extent and variety of Iranian drones, and the extent of Iran's murky collaboration with the current Russian war effort is far more extensive than reported in the mainstream media. This was a marriage made in hell, for Russia was in desperate need of arms, while Iran was cash-starved, due in part to the Trump administration's resumed sanctions against Iran following Trump's walking away from the nuclear deal with Iran previously in place. The reportage on the number, variety, and acquisition times of the drones has been most amply provided by the United States Institute of Peace in its The Iran Primer. For those with the bandwidth, you can Google it. And I'll provide a link elsewhere here on my YouTube channel. Though Russia's military has been viewed of late as less than impressive. It would be a mistake, I think, to believe that they won't learn from their experience. And a part of the Russian game plan has become to cause Ukraine to deplete its store of costly missiles, now including the Patriots, in shooting down Russia's inexpensive Iranian drones. And this seems a strategy the Russians had learned from Ukraine. For the ever-inventive and resourceful Ukrainian military had earlier employed a similar strategy, while aware of Russia's shortfall of more precise and expensive missiles. For immediately after its successful employment of the HIMARS, Ukraine then built numerous fake wooden HIMARS left in plain view to draw the fire of Russia's more precise and expensive missiles. The calibers, for example, which cost $6.5 million each and that have been taking months to manufacture. Russia's game plan to deplete Ukraine's own missile supply has become a further element in this war of attrition, and it's part of the long game Putin is now playing, one that he hadn't initially planned on, that of waging a stalling, if not a, quote, forever war. For his calculus now seems to be just holding on without conclusively losing, for as long as it takes the allies of Ukraine to grow weary of and thus fail to continue to support Ukraine's war efforts, thus presumably assuring a semblance of a Russian victory and Putin's ability to stay in power. But this long game has yet to bear fruit, and seems to rely not from confidence in Russia's own military superiority, but rather on the lack of long-range resolve by Ukraine's allies, something that is largely out of Putin's control. A long-shot bet that might require Trump or another right-wing candidate to prevail as the Republican candidate for the American presidency in 2024, which is seeming increasingly unlikely now, while Trump, facing the possibility of multiple indictments, continues to impotently boast that had the 2020 elections not been stolen from him, that the war Putin launched in February of 2022 never would have happened. But even short of another Trump presidency, the MAGA-led Republican House of Representatives that had assumed it controlled the nation's purse strings had also hinted it would cut back U.S. support of Ukraine. This, too, was nothing new and had already been telegraphed in the run-up to the American midterm elections of 2020, when the midterm elections of 2022, when the Trump-endorsed then senatorial nominee Vance of Ohio was arguing that rather than support Ukraine, our expenditure of resources should instead be America first. And of course, this Russian-favoring stance was immediately parroted by the now defrocked Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson. But the results of that midterm election were not favorable to the MAGA crowd, and that trend doesn't bode well for Putin moving forward. For Trump is increasingly framed as a loser and a drag on his party, with the result being that many of the candidates now emerging from the Republican ranks in their bid to be their party's choice for the 2024 presidential election are trying to free themselves from their past association with Trump, while leaning back toward the more traditional Republican stance, that of being Russia hawks and not threatening defense spending. And as it turned out, the MAGA wing of the party failed to get many of the concessions they'd banked on when they threatened the nation with economic chaos during the recent debt ceiling spectacle. Though they'll remain a thorn in the side of the more progressive wing of the American political system, their appeal seems to be waning, with the clout of the MAGA wing only decisive in the primaries and far less likely for the general election. Meanwhile, Putin now finds himself riding uncomfortably on the back of a tiger that he earlier mistook for a pussycat, and he can't jump off now or attempt to make peace with the Ukrainian tiger without being clawed elsewhere by Russia's ultra-right-wing patriots like you get I can't pronounce these Russian words very well, like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the fiery leader of the infamous Wagner Group, arguably Russia's most effective fighting unit. By the onset of the battle for Bakhmut, Prigozhin's paramilitary group had recruited 50,000 troops from Russian prisons. Prigozhin himself had spent a decade in prison for theft. The prisoners were offered a deal they seemingly couldn't refuse. The deal was that they be freed from prison and offered amnesty for their crimes if they could stay alive for 6 months fighting for the Wagner Group. Before being sent into battle, the Wagner recruits received training that by some accounts consisted mostly of how to crawl forward and keep advancing regardless of incoming fire. They were trained, in other words, to be fodder, and retreat was not an option. For those who failed to keep advancing, even while those all around them were being mowed down, were summarily executed on the spot. And with ammunition running low, the customary form of execution was having their skulls crushed by a sledgehammer. This was not exactly sophisticated military strategy, but pure intimidation even toward one's own comrades in arms. Though primitive to the max, it offered its own survival guide for the truly desperate, and many of their ranks went into battle with the same resignation as those who'd enter the Russian mafia, as if they'd entered an interior zone where they were already dead, as exhibited by the character Viggo Mortensen played in the excellent film Eastern Promises. Prigozhin and the rest of Russia's version of the extreme right wing, nearly every nation has them now, have grown increasingly impatient with Putin and his military's inability to win the war, advocating ever more draconian means, including the use of short-range tactical nuclear missiles. For though suffering an attrition of its non-nuclear missiles, Russia does possess the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. But quite recently, in mid-May of 2023, Prigozhin released a video where, against the backdrop of his fallen war dead, an outraged Prigozhin then publicly castigated Russia's military command for the lack of ammunition, though he did admit to instructing his own troops to use real bullets on any members of Russia's military if seen attempting to flee or retreat. In the political context of a Russia where real investigative journalism has become near impossible, it's been hard to read the significance of this and other of Prigozhin's recent tirades. Resultingly, political commentators have read the tea leaves here in a variety of ways. Some have assumed that Prigozhin never would have delivered such public statements without the complicity of Putin, and thus it might have presaged a more aggressive stance in the wings by Putin on the one hand, or the attempt by Putin to then posture his efforts as the more moderate and reasonable course. What seems knowable is that Prigozhin is different from popular and victorious Russian generals from former wars who may have posed threats to Putin. Not a small difference is that Prigozhin has his own army, and that has been quite effective. Plus, he's also different from other oligarchs whose wealth remains dependent on staying in Putin's good graces, for Prigozhin has his own income stream from African mining and other natural resource interests, and more recently he's helped keep other Russian elites in check by warning them if they don't contribute more to getting Russia on a true wartime footing, that they and their YouTube posting children could lose all that they now have, for there could be a revolution of sorts waiting in the wings. And his invectives suggest that times as these are not for pussies, which is how Prigozhin has portrayed the mainstream of Russia's army and those who have been leading it. Prigozhin's predictions of a possible future have been read differently by military and political commentators in their regard of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. In a June 9th Washington Post opinion piece, authored by Max Boot, and based largely on his interview and correspondence with David Petraeus, who just returned from Kiev, Petraeus was optimistic about Ukraine's prospects. Petraeus acknowledged that Ukraine's armed forces will have to advance against fortified defenses amply supported by artillery, as well as the advantages that those on defense have in war, though it remains to be seen whether the Russians will have the 3-to-1 numerical advantage or the increased capacity to keep their defenses well supplied, those that I earlier had mentioned. In fact, Petraeus notes that the Russians will have trouble responding to Ukrainian breakthroughs because they don't have sufficient reserves to cover a 600-mile front. But that doesn't necessarily mean the Ukrainians can end the war soon. Yet Petraeus was optimistic, both for Ukraine's morale advantage, as well as for the fact that Ukraine now has something it didn't have during its last successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv last fall. Several new armored brigades and as many as 40,000 troops trained by NATO and armed with German and British tanks and other armored vehicles capable of breaching Russian trenches and plowing through Russian minefields, though neither side will have air superiority, for the F-16s that Ukraine had been pleading for since the inception of the war won't be arriving until fall. Another commentator, Julia Yaffe, founding partner and Washington correspondent of Puck, thinks that the counteroffensive will be much more difficult than the fall of 2022 counteroffensive when Ukraine won back Kharkiv and Kherson. Her gut feeling was that Ukraine will outperform as usual, just not enough for the Russian army to collapse and for Ukraine to fully win the war. Her worry was that, quote, Putin will be able to throw as much fodder toward the meat grinder as he wants, while waiting for the U.S. Republicans to retake more power on the Hill, leading U.S. support for Ukraine to dry out. Her take on Putin's hope as has often been the case for Russian warfare, is that time or bad weather will do the winning for him. In the wake of the recent G7 conference in Japan, some attending it, as well as many other Ukrainians, are convinced that Prigozhin's brazen attacks signal that Putin no longer has the means to control the hardliners, those even more psychopathic than Putin. Yet, if there are stirrings in Russia now that have begun to destabilize Putin's hold on Russia, that's no guarantee that whoever might replace him will be Mr. Nice Guy or a more Gorbachev-like figure, but rather perhaps someone more monstrous still, like Prigozhin. In the wake of the Japan summit, a couple of other insightful figures have recently returned from Kiev and bearing their insights on the likely future of the war. One of them was Gideon Rose, Distinguished Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. When interviewed by Fareed Zakaria, Rose was asked for his perspective on how wars end. And Rose said that wars end in one of two ways. The first is when the war has come to a durable stalemate that gives no indication of changing, while the second way is when both sides begin to realize that the trend has irreversibly changed in the favor of one side. Rose feels that the momentum has begun to swing in favor of Ukraine. They could really win, though they still may be a year away from achieving that irreversible trend. For Ukraine has already withstood Russia's best punch, yet is still standing, with the collective will of her people firmly intent upon kicking Russia out of their country. And for the Ukrainians, that means not only recovering the territory lost since Russia's invasion of late February 2022, but from 2014 as well. Rose said that what's really important now, and in the time ahead, is that Ukraine needs to be given the weapons it needs to win. The same conclusion drawn by Patriot, as well as by Ian Williams in another of his insightful CSIS reports. If those weapons continue to arrive, and in a timely enough manner, this next stage of the war may be when the gap between the Russian view of its own military supremacy and its own actual weakness begins to be more publicly recognized in Russia. I'd be remiss not to mention something else that occurred during the recent G7 summit in Japan. A provocative Russian move intended to warn those attending it of the dire consequence about to be faced by the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the economic losses of any of her allies still funding it. For that's when intimidating bullies do what bullies do. Russia launched a volley of the invincible hypersonic Kinzhal missiles on Kiev. The result? The Patriots knocked every one of them out of the sky. Also just returned from Kiev was Kori Schake, whom Zakaria also interviewed on the same show as Rose. She is director and defense policy of foreign and defense policy studies. She's also a Republican. Like Rose, she also seemed uplifted and optimistic about Ukraine in the days following the Japan summit. And when asked about the likelihood of Ukraine continuing to get support from a Republican-led Congress in the next stage of the war, her optimism surprised me, but not the impact of her reasoning, which was simply this: for 5% of U.S. defense spending, and no loss of American lives, the Ukrainians have been destroying the Russian army. Though perhaps ill-advised, I'd like to end this long narrative with a postscript. Some, like Einstein and most of the world's mystics, have believed that the world is not merely a succession of accidental, random, or meaningless events, and that, whatever you call it, there is an ordering principle alive in the world, and that it has its own will, its own timing. And thus, current events are not entirely unrelated to each other, or unrelated to what's occurring in our own minds, or what's occurring on the evening news. Just as military campaigns are not unrelated to politics. In a sense, the world, and what happens when, is all part of the same unfolding. Most of the world's religions have teachings, pith instructions, or exalted exemplars of this understanding. Say what Christians and Muslims have termed God's will, or what Taoists have termed the Tao. In fact, I've just finished writing a book about this, and have just begun to search for an agent or publisher. If you know any, please get in touch with me. But from this more unitary view, as I've attempted to provide something of an overview of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Republican Party in America has been attempting a counteroffensive of its own, as it has begun to look toward the upcoming 2024 presidential election. Thus far, it seems to have forced all candidates not named Trump to attempt an unconvincing balancing act. The effort seems to be bending their political bodies into a new pose that would never be attempted or recommended by any yoga teacher or physical therapist. This uncomfortable move involves bending enough to the left so as to appear more normal, like someone who might actually defend the Constitution and not offend mainstream voters, yet somehow to bend, at least in their words, enough to the right so as to not draw the ire of Trump's diehard, flame-throwing base. But this leaves these candidates lacking the charisma of Trump, and to lack as well much in the way of conceptual coherence or integrity. And these candidates seem to instill little genuine passion or appeal to anyone. And though too early to be conclusive yet, that seems reflected in the most recent polling. Their attempts to adapt to the nature of the time appear to have come too late in a political season when their former leader is facing the prospect of multiple indictments in Florida, Georgia, Manhattan, New York State, and the District of Columbia. I'd imagine that those involved in prosecuting the nation's 45th president have drawn strength from the simultaneous presence of prosecutors in different venues, for this is something that's never happened before, and the weight of bearing this alone could have been too much for almost anyone. Forgive me for saying so, but the Republican Party itself seems to have grown corrupted and continues to remain corrupted in the attempt to defend what is indefensible. Republican leaders who might now be called to the rescue those still bearing any aura of Lincoln's grand old party had long ago been thrown under the bus. That bus has no one to drive it anywhere now but off a cliff that many Republicans had been unknowingly and hypnotically drawn toward since the earliest days of the Trump presidency, and it's been hard for them now to change course in a believable way. Though we Americans at large tend to suffer now from a narrowing attention span, if not political amnesia, this is apparently not the case for what the ancient Greeks called nemesis, or what the Buddhists call karma. For these forces, however you might name them, have had a thousands-year-long reputation for punishing those who have violated something in the very fabric of life. And though psychopaths have a genius for committing crimes while evading accountability, for figures like Putin or Trump, that evasion can only last for so long. It is an uncanny skill that few have, like a dark art, but it's not an eternal keep out of jail card. They are being pursued by something. Whether Jack Smith, the special counsel of the Department of Justice in the Trump investigations, or the righteous resolve of the Ukrainian army, and for all of Trump's bravado, or Putin's numbed, vacant gaze into space, I suspect that they already feel it deep in their bones. And so I don't think it's a matter of if they fall, merely when. For some, it's been almost incomprehensible how long it's taken for some form of justice to begin to prevail. But in wiser moments, I believe that, whatever you call it, has its own impeccable timing.